prend de l'importance, qui devient de plus en plus visible, je crois, et de plus en plus nécessaire. Bienvenue à vous. Merci aux deux participants d'aujourd'hui. Et Sash, I'll let you continue in English.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone offline and online. I hope and I know that there will be really more people because a lot of people wrote me about connecting to this seminar. So it's my pleasure, and yeah, I see these people, so it's my pleasure to open this seminar and probably to say a few words about the series of these seminars called Critical Heritage Studies in Post-Socialist Space that this year focused on the problem, more broad problem of heritage and war. And today we will discuss the Ukrainian heritage in the context of Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine and in the context of war. And we will have two presentations for 25, 30 minutes for each presentation. And after that, we will open floor for your comments and questions, both online and offline. So the first presenter is Simon Radchenko. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Stavanger, Norway. His primary research focus covers digital methods of heritage, of cultural heritage preservation and research focusing on prehistoric art in Ukraine and Norway. So the floor is yours, and after the first presentation, we will listen to the next presentation, and again after that, we will open floor for questions. So, Simon, the floor is yours. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I will now try to share my screen and my slides. Yeah, please note if you see them. Great. Yes, so I will talk today about what's going on with Ukrainian heritage, cultural heritage in context of war and Russian full-scale invasion. That will be very much of Ukrainian perspective on the issue, so I will not pretend to be emotionally neutral or anything. And my idea for today's talk would be to show some more or less synthesized picture of what's going on with Ukrainian cultural heritage on the front line. We now have a lot of Ukrainian archaeologists who deal with some specific issue there, mostly monitoring the front line and searching for the heritage, cultural heritage damage examples, issues, checking if everything is all right and what needs to be fixed urgently or more urgently than other. But we kind of lack this generalized synthesized picture. So I know some of my colleagues try to do this, and we all employ our own perspective. And this will be my own perspective on how this can be synthesized and generalized. You all know the map, the deep state map. There are basically three types of zones here. One of those that were occupied without a huge battle or occupied before 2022 or just rapidly taken by Russians in spring 2022, winter spring 2022. Other is the front line. It is in red, in like strong red. And the third one is what is beyond the front line. This dashed line marks something that has been occupied but is now beyond the front line. So basically these three areas, three types of areas mark different types of cultural heritage offenses because they can be reached by Russian military and Russian authorities in different ways. So the actions on these territories are different. And I will go through them trying to make more or less systematic outlook with some more vague examples and some more specific ones. All in all, we see that all these three territories, they are under different types of pressure. There is certainly institutional pressure that Russian authorities and Russian military cause on cultural heritage. And there are some individual actions that are happening there, and also some indirect things that we are not thinking as cultural heritage offenses, and they are not recognized as cultural heritage crimes. But since they damage the heritage in the long run, I will still emphasize them as well. Institutional is the simplest one, and the frontline is the easiest. So we'll start with that, and then we'll see how it goes. So when we are talking about institutional cultural heritage offenses done on the front line, the first thing that comes to mind is shelling on the front line and damage because of shelling and because of battlefield. Ministry of Culture now registered more than 1,190 archaeological sites damaged, and then Crimean Institute for Strategic Studies took over this initiative and registered more than 1,100 more. And now they stopped, by the way, because they were sponsored by USAID, and for some reason this work is now not going further. And generally this number is not real because there are sites that don't fall to that categories. To say that something has been damaged for sure, we need to have a visual evidence for that. And we need this visual evidence to clearly show that something has been damaged. And that's not always that we can do that. This picture on the screen is very straightforward. You can recognize each black dot as the sign of shelling, as the place where missile hit. And these green dots on the screen are kurgans, so archaeological sites and archaeological landscape landmarks. All of them on this field were damaged, and supposedly, and for this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we can see the damage caused by the shelling from the satellite view. So we have more than 10,000 kurgans in Zaporizhia Oblast, just those that were registered before the war. And kurgan is a very good landscape landmark because they are higher in Ukrainian steppe. They are well visible. They are very prompt to be used for trenches and defensive structures, and they are very good to be shelled. So most of them are likely damaged by these actions. This is one more example from Crimean Institute for Strategic Studies, how kurgan has been used as a quarter with trenches, with counter drone points and counter missile points, and many other defensive structures. And we see this picture all along the front line. We can't actually calculate how many kurgans were damaged, of course, but we can easily assume that the number is way higher than thousands. And the even more complicated thing to calculate would be minefields. We have an approximate account of how many minefields are located in the occupied and deoccupied parts of Ukraine. Look at this number, 1,513 near Kharkiv, which is a very very high number, and it kind of indicates all Kharkiv region is now covered with mines. And mines make this weird type of archaeological sites that are Schrödinger sites. They are not damaged yet, but they definitely will be. They are disturbed, and the context is disturbed. So most probably we can't think of them as integral archaeological sites with preserved context. And what's going on there needs to be investigated separately. When we were talking about Stone Age sites, it can be that they are secure, for example, sometimes. But if we are talking about medieval ones, they are most likely destroyed. And this comes very handy for Russian authoritarian narrative about colonizing steppe of Ukraine, where it's very easy to destroy all medieval sites and then pretend there's nothing there. A bright example of that would be a settlement near Konski Vody, where there used to be a hill fort of Ulus Juchi. I used to excavate there several years ago, and we well know that now the site is damaged, and the only structure that used to be there is not available for archaeological studies anymore. And of course, sometimes these actions on the front line, they damage the buildings as well. This one on the top left is the regional museum in Makariv that has been shelled. It has been the place for the battlefields. I mean, the locations of the museum has been places for struggle, and then it was looted when Russians went out of it. The one on the bottom right is the castle of Popov in Zaporizhia Oblast in Vasilievka. It has just been shelled by Russians casually and probably looted afterward, but we are not sure about that. And the one on the bottom left is Vytautas Tower that were located right where Kakhovka Dam was situated. So we know that it survived the flood after the dam was blasted, but we don't know what's going on with archaeological context there. Yeah, there are rare examples of individual cultural heritage offenses on the front line, so offenses done by individuals. The good thing about this type of offenses is that these are those that we can recognize as cultural heritage crimes because we can figure out who specifically did the action and was there a military purpose or not for that. But since it's very hard to figure out the individual and prove that there was no military purpose, we only have several cases of that. The most apparent is the Museum of Grigoriy Skovoroda nearby Kharkiv that has been shelled in 2022, and a Ukrainian General Prosecutor Office launched a prosecution against Denis Kulsh, who accused of shelling this museum. We know that there was no Ukrainian military when the museum was shelled, so it's like clearly cultural heritage crime. But we only have a few cases of this type of offense. It's more tricky with indirect damage on the front line because this is definitely not a cultural heritage crime done by specific Russian soldiers or officers, but obviously Ukrainian soldiers also build trenches and also create minefields, and that damages archaeological sites, like, for example, this place called Oster in Chernihiv region, where 11th century church was damaged, and the Russian Kievan Rus hill fort was damaged by Ukrainian trenches, and sometimes sites like that are also damaged with Russian shells. So while this is damaged directly caused by Ukrainian soldiers, it is very important to recognize it as damage caused by Russian invasion. And this is something we sometimes have challenged to talk about in Ukraine, because there's certainly a hesitation to say that Ukrainian soldiers can damage Ukrainian cultural heritage. But I think it's important to acknowledge this as well and point to their responsibility, to whose responsibility is that. And another indirect damage to Ukrainian cultural heritage is obviously cultural heritage experts who's been killed by Russians on the front line. Now 14 of my colleagues were killed and more than 50 are on the front line right now. Why is that important in the first place? Because it damages institution in the long run. University professors are not given classes, not preparing new archaeologists. There are people who were responsible for their only topic in Ukrainian archaeology, and now when they are gone, the whole branch of thinking, the whole ideas about specific archaeological culture or specific time period is dead because they are not able to proceed with their studies. So this is given that we used to think that Ukraine don't have more than 300 archaeologists in total before the war. Losing 14 is quite a number. When we talk about what's going on the occupied lands, it's maybe the most interesting in terms of what's actually going on and what Russian authorities are doing there. So this will be maybe the longest segment, and it's quite iconic in a way. I will be talking more about Kam'yana Mohyla National Reserve in Zaporizhia region because first, that's my PhD and that's something that's a place I spent some years, but also that's a very well-documented case of what's going on there on the occupied land. So this is the only large rock art location in Ukraine, and in 1,000 kilometers from Kamienna Mohyla, there's no other large rock art location. The closest one is actually Gobustan in Azerbaijan, and maybe Kapova in Ural Mountains. This is tentative UNESCO World Heritage List, was before the war, and it contains rock art, engravings, prehistoric art that with links from Central Europe to Western Mongolia. It's like incredible site with a very broad range of interesting themes. It was occupied in spring 2022. It's basically a huge archaeological complex with an enormous time span of what's going on there. Each ring on the picture shows the archaeological location, with Kamienna Mohyla being here in the center as number one. There are 68 rock art locations on this hill. This is a hill made of sandstone slabs with caves inside, and caves are usually filled with engravings and different types of prehistoric art. That's interesting that UNESCO and UNOSAT uses this map we made together with the staff of the reserve to track changes and destructions on the of the rock art location. But we know that this monitoring is not efficient because there can be destructions inside the hill caves and grottos that we will not see on the satellite image. One of them happened in 2020. We don't know if any happened before the war or after the invasion. But I am sporadically in touch with people who work there, and they say it's relatively safe. What we also know is that, yeah, there are some examples of these engravings that are on Kamienna Mohyla. These are Sarmatia and Tamgas with abundant analogies from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. These are Neolithic images of bulls and horses, probably 5,000 years old, and likely related to local Ukrainian Neolithic tradition, but also to Central Asian rock art tradition with analogies from Tamgali or Eshkelmes or other large UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Kazakhstan. And this is likely a Mesolithic Stone Age figure interpreted as either a fish or a dragon, attributed somewhat 8,000 years old. Yeah, so museum was looted during 2022-2023. Almost 1,300 objects were transferred to Chersonesos, and they are now in Sevastopol in Chersonesos. And among them, 2023 portable rock art objects. I will be talking about these ones more because they are cataloged quite well, and we can associate specific piece to its inventory number, so we can actually launch an investigation, of seeing them. So yeah, I will be showing more about that now. Now you can see there are empty vitrines, and I made a short time lapse of how this looting actually works, how it is institutionalized by Russian government. So there's an occupation in March. Then Sergei Narishkin and Vladimir Putin discussed the scene at the Russian Historical Society meetings and Russian Traditional Religions meetings, figure out that Kamienna Mohyla is important, it should be preserved. So all portable there should be looted to a safer place. Safer place is Chersonesos. So there is an order signed by Mishustin about transferring these scenes and making Kamienna Mohyla a branch of Chersonesos. This order is then implemented by local collaboration authorities, both in Crimea, Chersonesos, and in Zaporizhia. And then these objects are transferred to Chersonesos. In May 2023, we already see first exhibitions of these portable rock art instances there. And by the images in Russian social media, we can associate these objects from Sevastopol, like this from top right, to these objects as they were recorded in the Museum of Kamienna Mohyla. Here you can see two objects. I was able to recognize 19 going through catalogs and trying to associate them. The fun part is what I notice in Russian media about exhibitions of Kamena Mohyla rock art is that sometimes these objects are placed upside down in the vitrines in Sevastopol without general understanding of what's going on there. And there's no specific investigation of what's actually happening with the collection because Russian cultural heritage experts from Crimea just repeat the old school narrative of 40 years old about the attribution of these instances to Upper Paleolithic and whatever, even though it is kind of proven that they are way younger. So this cultural heritage efforts of Russian experts are not very updated on what they are showing. 19 objects I was able to identify. There are more, but I only work with those that I have in the catalog. We know that there are other instances like that. There is, top left, this exhibition that has been made in Novgorod with Crimean, with the golden objects from Crimea, specifically from Chersonesos. Museum of Kamienka-Znamenka specifically to attract tourists to local museums in Zaporizhia region. And in 3 years after that, it has been looted and transferred to Russia. We don't know its location, and we are actually not sure how the looting of Kamienka-Znamenka happened. So there's no specific record, and we don't know if that's institutionalized looting or individual one. When it goes to individual illegal actions on the occupied territories, the most important one is archaeological excavations on the archaeological sites in the occupation. The most notorious example is Chersonesos. There's also Kamena Mohyla, but Chersonesos is the brightest one, the best recorded. Basically, all archaeological actions that happen on the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine should be approved by Ministry of Culture and Strategic Communications of Ukraine. If they are not, it violates Hague Convention and Nicosia Convention, and obviously Ukrainian law. And we quite often see the military presence on national reserves and archaeological locations and cultural heritage locations on the occupied territories of Ukraine, which, as we know from people who stood in occupation and who are now located, Ukrainians who are now located on the occupied territories of Ukraine, causes pressure on local administration of cultural heritage sites, fostering them to collaborate and forcing them to share Russian narratives instead of, basically preserving cultural heritage as they should. We know very well from, for example, record of the staff of Melitopol Museum that there has been kidnapping, tortures, and both of these actions connected to looting of cultural heritage goods. And we know that sometimes it leads to mass kills and mass graves, which is an extra case and also a good example of how much of a dark cultural heritage we will have in Ukraine after the war. There is this 3D model of top right. This is the mass grave near Izium. And this is a good example of how well Ukrainian civil institutions actually try to attract attention using those instruments that they would use to attract the attention to cultural heritage. What is called dark heritage, I guess. Beyond the front line, it's way more obvious, but the most important part is individual and indirect, while the most clear is the institutional. Institutional is shelling. I included here the Bristol Hotel in Odessa that has been shelled in January 2025, quite recently. This continues, and each day some cultural heritage object is damaged. Most of the sites recorded as such by Ministry of Culture are located on beyond the front line, but we are now actually almost not doing new work to register these sites since it doesn't really, it's not really efficient. The damage happens every day and we can't really calculate what's going on there. It's kind of challenging to assess the damage as well because Russian strikes tend to hit the same place twice. So it's also dangerous, especially in locations like historic town of Odessa, also UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is located right near the docks that has been shelled heavily. So the cultural heritage site is shelled too. And it's quite challenging to assess it. Also, even though I mentioned this UNESCO World Heritage Site suffix, we should all understand that this is a useless suffix because there's no real help in dealing with cultural heritage preservation when it comes to the jeopardized locations. So yeah, we have what we have. In terms of individual impact of individual cultural heritage offenses done by Russian personalities beyond the front line, I must mention the publications in the internationally recognized journals, also Elsevier Group, also Scopus affiliated group and Web of Science affiliated group that refer to excavations in Crimea and behind that basically legitimizes Russian presence and presence of Russian cultural heritage narratives on the territory on the territory internationally recognized as Ukrainian. There are some more peculiar cases, like, for example, this paper in Nature, bottom left, that includes as co-authors Christian Christensen and Mark Allentoft and the most bright minds of paleogenetics of today, together with people affiliated with Moscow State University that worked with materials extracted from Ukrainian sites and published them as Russian materials extracted from post-Soviet territories. And obviously, this material being published in this high-ranked publication legitimizes Russian presence on Ukrainian territories, which aligns very well to this excerpt, this interview of Mikhail Piotrowski and all other instances of Russian, basically governmental imperialism. And we know that it caused, that it affected Ukrainian cultural heritage experts even before the war. This is a peculiar case, but it is a very good example of what I'm about to say. So in 2020, there was a debate about how old is actually the city of Zaporizhia. And while cultural heritage experts mostly claimed it is 2050 years old, and the city was established as Alexandrivsky Hillfort, Alexandrovskaya Крепость, or Alexandrovsky Farstadt during Russian military presence in Ukrainian steppe. There were cultural heritage experts and local authorities who tried to claim the origin of Zaporizhia from Kievan Rus times, which does not have any specific archaeological evidence, material evidence, or even historical evidence, but they were prompt to do so to avoid Russian narratives and to avoid association of Zaporizhia with Russia. And this is a very good example how even not aggressive Russian presence in the cultural heritage narrative cause a disturbance in how cultural heritage of Ukraine is accessed by Ukrainian scholars. And obviously Russian archaeologists are not helping here as well, most of them, when they refer to Ukraine as southwest part of CIS, or post-SNG, or Great Russian Plains, or the territory, the former territory of USSR, whatever. This is, not something that helps Ukrainian narrative to survive. So what we see there is that all these modes of cultural heritage offenses are presented. Not all of them, almost none of them are cultural heritage crimes directly. and can be prosecuted as crimes, but they are damaging cultural heritage of Ukraine. To sum up, 1,000 cultural heritage locations are destroyed. There are looted artifacts there that are unlikely to return to Ukraine anytime soon because we really don't see the mechanism of how that should happen. I kind of tend to think that some artifacts are lost forever. We have evidences of people trying to sell cultural heritage, Ukrainian cultural heritage abroad via international auctions. Some sites, including Kam'yana Mohyla and Khersonesus, were damaged and looted or reconstructed heavily, as you probably know happened in Khersonesus, where new buildings were erected right on top of archaeological layers, and that damaged the UNESCO World Heritage Landscape. And Ukraine don't have enough cultural heritage experts and expertise even before the war. We did not do our homework quite well into preserving cultural heritage and as institution before the war, but now we are paying for that. As observations, we see that cultural heritage is damaged both by direct destructive means as a collateral of military actions. So it's not that it's always the case that cultural heritage must be destroyed, but it's destroyed anyway. No effort is made to preserve Ukrainian heritage, including heritage of non-Ukrainian ethnical origin. I refer here mostly to Crimean Tatars and Crimean Karaites that suffered same as Ukrainians in terms of cultural heritage preservation. Cultural heritage offenses are a mix of what Russia did to Ukrainian heritage and what Soviet Union did to Ukrainian heritage, and what was tested in Syria with Syrian cultural heritage sites. Well, these parallels are also, I'm not the first to draw these parallels. And yeah, this framework of total destruction basically affects Ukrainian cultural heritage on all levels. And on a more emotional note, to us Ukrainians, it feels in a very same attitude as this paper that you probably all know about что Россия должна сделать с Украиной. Basically, what's happening with Ukrainian heritage fits very well to what is written here, especially if you think of also of Ukrainian students that are not able to educate themselves to restore cultural heritage properly because they are being shelled in educational institutions. Ukrainian kids being kidnapped and ideologically indoctrinated, and all that basically leads to the conclusion that even when we are not talking about cultural heritage, but cultural heritage institution, it is as an institution, it is actually the main target of damage that affects the long-run potential of Ukrainians to form the proper cultural heritage narrative that would justify their identity and sovereignty, which is ultimately, as we understand, the goal of the whole full-scale invasion. So we lost our sovereignty, and damaging cultural heritage and cultural heritage as an institution is a very efficient instrument of doing that. That's what we see now, and that's what we will see in the nearest future, as it seems. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this brilliant, honest, and very serious talk about this problem. And we will discuss it after the next presentation. So the second presenter is Dina Gusejnova. She is associate professor at the International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her main research deals with the cultural and intellectual fallout of two world wars. She is also the co-lead of the project 2022, a project investigating the impact of Russian full-scale war invasion against Ukraine on research and education in Europe funded by the European Union. So Dina, the floor is yours. We have 30 minutes for the presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexandra, and also to Svetlana. Many thanks for inviting me. Let me start. Sorry, I'm just trying to find one. Great. Can you see it? I hope that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Works. Thank you.
Yes, so let me begin. I think this will follow quite logically, I hope, from Simon's presentation, and it will dig a little bit more deeply into the kind of Russian perspective in terms of the preparation for or what now retrospectively appears as the ideological preparation for the full-scale invasion, and the sort of the kind of work, manipulative really work with presenting heritage, particularly of the steppe cultures in the sort of culture industry, let's say, surrounding our cultural institutions, both in Russia and in the occupied territories. I want to begin, though, with a slightly kind of look back on the way that the story of these Babas has reached, or maybe might have reached, international publics. I'm talking about these stone idols here in the front cover of my presentation that are known as the Polovtsian Babas or the stone Babas. There were idols that were produced by Turkic nomadic peoples in the Eurasian steppes. And yeah, I'm going to say a little bit more about the dating question of them. But my primary conversation really will evolve around the changing sort of framings, in a sense, of these figures in different contexts. But I want to begin with a story by Anton Chekhov, because it sort of brings us to the moment in the 19th century when, at one level, the archaeological institutions of the Russian Empire were beginning to be more systematically engaged with this legacy, and also through translations were reaching a wider public. And I think the translation of this Chekhov story shows how, in this process, actually this particular heritage of these Turkic peoples was, in a sense, erased or reduced. I've highlighted here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I've highlighted here a particular moment when the reader's attention or gaze in the Russian version is directed to the appearance of these stone idols in the steppes. So this phrase «Для разнообразия мелькнет в бурьяне белый череп или булыжник, вырастет на мгновение серая каменная баба или высохшая ветла синей ракшей на верхней ветке». So it's a sort of appearance in a landscape of this characteristic figure that really roots the story in the steppes. And you can see how in the English translation, the specificity of this idol is actually reduced. So it's just described as a gray stone with no particular ritual or otherwise significance. And I think something similar is sort of happening in a way, I would say, in the kind of media coverage of the impact of the Russian war on Ukrainian heritage, because it's often discussed, I would say, internationally without particular specificity about the multi-ethnic kind of character of the heritage that is actually being destroyed in the war. And just a second kind of framing, I suppose, so this Polovtsian culture that's supposed to be kind of cryptic and somewhat unclear what exactly sort of it was that left the legacy of these stone idols. Of course, another way in which it has been framed was in the so-called Ballet Russe, again, the sort of Russian imperial culture that, of course, is now, again, widely kind of re-evaluated and in some ways decolonized and sort of broken down into different components. But still, I think in the broader international perception remains kind of Russian as a kind of label, right? It retains its Russian label. If we go back, though, to earlier accounts of the Eurasian steppes, then a very different picture emerges. So we have various travelogues that show the steppe cultures kind of on their own terms. So a steppe belt reaching from Central Europe via Ukraine to Southern Russia, Central Asia, into Mongolia and China, where travelers since the 12th century really would often notice the presence of these large stone figures overlooking a desolate landscape. They had sometimes male, usually female characteristics as fertility statues, and were often located around what looked like sacred or burial sites. So these kurgans we saw in the presentation, in Simon's presentation. And they likely belong to the Turkic nomadic cultures, but some of the dating dates them to the 3rd or 2nd millennium BC, whereas others are dated around the 11th or 10th century. And the big time span is sort of confusing and subject to a lot of debate, but I'm hesitant, since this is not at all my area of expertise. I'm hesitant to give you any more authoritative background on this, but I just want to chart it there as a kind of presence. And of course, new technologies, dating technologies, allow for more precise identification. And then subsequent polities, from the Zaporozhian Cossacks to the nobility and peasants of the Kievan Rus, and then the cultures of the Russian Empire, and then the Ukrainian nation states, then incorporated these cultures into different contexts, rituals and legends. They were used as spaces of punishment, or they were incorporated as decorative or functional pieces in estates and houses. I will show pictures of it later. In this paper, I want to explore a bit more these kind of, I suppose they are called regimes of historicity, since we are in Paris with François Hartog, which are constituted by states, but by modern museums also working in the service of states, but also private actors. And I want to see how particularly territorial states are trying to make sense of these fixtures that are yet actually legacies of non-territorial societies, nomadic societies. The treatment of these statues in public museum collections, where they're taken out of context of the anthropology of either Turkic or nomadic societies in general, reveals a great deal, I would say, about the ideological orientation of the changing regimes in this region. I came to this topic, which lies really quite far outside my usual research areas, via a rather indirect route. So I hope you will sort of excuse me as I describe it. I'm just going to show some images from previous kind of contextualizations of these statues. In 2017, I was doing some research on the work of the visual social scientists who came from Red Vienna to the USSR. And then I ended up making a documentary film about the way the Moscow State Historical Museum presents information, which sort of came out of this project. The State Historical Museum is in the center, right on #1 Red Square. It has around 40 rooms, beginning in prehistoric times, such as the Iron and Bronze Ages, and then ending with the court culture in St. Petersburg. But none of these rooms deal with the 20th century. And one of the concerns of the film quickly became not just to show why there's no 20th century, but also to explore how around 2012 or so, a new narrative had begun of a kind of chauvinist Russian neo-imperialism, in which the process of which even the name Kievan Rus was progressively erased from the museum, and the corresponding room instead named the Great Migration of Peoples, so that the narrative became refocused on a kind of social history of displacement rather than a history of different polities. And another element that appeared in the story, you see here a kind of sort of pro-Kremlin historian who's describing, I suppose, a kind of Kremlin version of the Bloodlands. He's talking about the Russian flatlands. This again to echo Simon's description of the Kremlin narrative that has kind of erased any political specificity here and is trying to kind of rationalize, in a sense, the space retrospectively. In a public audience discussion, you can see curiously this kind of strange interplay between this highly politicized narrative, some of the purposes of which is really to legitimate kind of a new expansionist conception of Russia, with these really strange idols looking on, as if they were active participants in the conversation. In fact, I noticed that the only remaining artifacts in that museum, which the rewriting could not really recontextualize effectively, were the stone barbers, which reached from the Donetsk region to the Caucasus and Altai. They were seemingly looking into the museum as visitors, as if nothing could affect them. In fact, they are placed in rooms 11 or 12 of the museum in the context of the history of the Mongolian horde. But in a way that caused ambiguity to the narrative. What the story didn't quite make clear is, were the stone idols produced by the Mongols, who are presented in the Russian narrative as kind of the Asiatic others that the sort of Russia supposedly defeated, or were they tributary relations with the Mongols that likely involved different other tribes and also the princes of the Rus? Who were the princes of the Rus anyway in relation to subsequent Russian polities? All of this is left very ambiguous, and instead the text says, the curatorial text says, nobody knows where they came from or where they were going. So they're left as kind of enigmatic. What I wanted to know at this point is, how did successive generations of curators incorporate these nomads into their museum narratives? The museum itself was a kind of product of the sort of imperial era emphasis on kind of Muscovite culture against St. Petersburg. So in a sense, the kind of Kiev part of the story was not central to the kind of the cultural interventions of the museum. But the people behind the museum were advocates of this new imperial patriotism. So figures like Alexei Uvarov or the Moscow antiquary Slavophile Ivan Zabelin. They were mirrored by wealthy contemporary entrepreneurs such as Sava Mamontov, who had sourced his own stone Baba during the construction of a railway network in the Donbas region and brought them home to his estate of Abramtsevo near Moscow. In this process of reconstructing where the Babas in the Moscow State Historical Museum came from, some of which came from these private estates. I think this one here on the right that you can see in this picture, sort of in the profile. I sort of discovered how revealing the politics of collecting were of different political moments in the ideological history of the USSR and also the post-Soviet period. So as I do not have to tell this audience, the period from the Russian Civil War to the 1930s was also contested among curators. Even though surprising continuities persisted throughout this period, both in terms of personnel and in terms of approach. The archaeological research which was produced on the steppe cultures came out of the Imperial School of Archaeology. This was later developed on the one hand by the Moscow-centric curators ranging from Nikolai Gumilyov with his ethnogenesis concept developed during years of imprisonment, or Mikhail Artamonov, the peasant-born archaeologist with a passion for the Kurgan cultures of the Don, which he developed during the Great Patriotic War. He rose to be the director of the St. Petersburg Hermitage. The Bolsheviks adopted the language of enlightenment against idolatry and applied it to the busts and monuments to the Tsars by calling, sorry, I'm going to show, sorry, I'm going to just show some of these house of kind of showing the kind of well, popularity of these statues. Here also in Kharkiv, one of these figures. You can also see among the modernists a fascination with these in the 1900s. But I'm sorry, I'm looking for the next. Oh, yeah, this is the one. So the Bolshevik decree on monuments has been calling on removing the most, how do you call it, the most sort of egregiously ugly idols. So снять некоторые наиболее уродливые стуканы, by which they meant idols, monuments to the Tsars. But that language was ambiguous, so they kind of tried to apply the language that the modernists had used to describe the stone idols to kind of ridicule, I suppose, the imperial culture of the pre-Soviet era. At this point, the Ukrainian archaeological school is significant. By the 1920s, the Ukrainian archaeologist Dmitry Yavornitsky, who had been researching the Zaporozhian Cossacks before the revolution, but also compiled a dictionary of Ukrainian language and studies of Ukrainian antiquity, was walking really on the edge of the ideologically permissible work in archaeology and ethnography, as he used the construction of the Dnipro hydroelectric station in Zaporozhye, which was constructed around 1927 to 32, to expand the collections of the former Yekaterinoslav local history museum in Dnieper, then Dnipropetrovsk, built in 1849. So when, at the time of the Holodomor, he began to sell off his private collection to support some of the local starving population. But eventually Yavornitsky was forced to resign from his position as director of the Museum of Local History, accused of bourgeois tendencies and imprisoned, dying in 1940 in prison from pneumonia. This is just one of many examples of the, let's say, euphemistically divergent paths of curators involved in assembling and narrating some of the nomadic past in Ukraine's Soviet history, but also in changing historical periods. But now let's move to the present situation. Sorry, here are some of the Soviet monuments that were replacing the so-called idols of the imperial era. here's a picture of the Yavornitsky, and of course the famous Repin kind of revival of the Cossack history in his paintings. And there's also a Yavornitsky, of course, memorial now in Dnipro, now protected here against shelling, photographed by Victoria Ivleva. So after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 22, this nomadic but highly immobile and thus endangered material legacy acquired a renewed significance in the local experience of the conflict, as well as in the Kremlin-directed information war around it. To give two examples, the Russian attack on the city of Mariupol destroyed 95% of the city's infrastructure, killing at least 21,000 civilians. Amidst the destruction, the stone barbers were also making an appearance, as if they had woken from their century-long sleep by the attacks. The Mariupol History Museum, local history museum, was entirely burnt out in the attack, but the stone barbers adorning the museum outside survived. And the discourse around the barbers produced by the Russian occupation concentrated on the fact that these were items of great value to local and national heritage, which had now been destroyed by fascists and so-called Ukrainian nationalists. Here's the director of the kind of pro-Russian Mariupol State Historical Museum, invited on Russian state TV program Ours, like Nasze, in November 23, kind of speaking to this about this experience as a kind of attempt to rescue from the fascists. In Izium, a city which the Ukrainian army recaptured, these idols were identified by Ukrainian commentators with local heritage and culture. Here, sorry, this is the Mariupol, the Babas, which had kind of survived the attack. Russian state media, with no evidence whatsoever, claimed that the destruction of Mariupol by Ukrainian nationalists, which was something, I quote, which even the fascists in the Second World War did not manage to touch, end quote. In fact, though, it's worth going into more detail into what happened under the German occupation of Soviet Ukraine, the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, which was really quite the opposite. Because both the warrior and the fertility statues were objects of special interest for the Nazis due to their supposed connection to the history of the Indo-Germanic peoples. So destruction was entirely out of the question. In particular, the Ahnenerbe Ancestral Heritage Department, researching the Center of Aryan and Indo-Germanic cultures, in parallel with the Third Reich's actual eastern expansion, had set up specific digs in different parts of Ukraine, drawing on the SS Battalion Viking, which included volunteers from Belgium and the Netherlands, but also an international scientific team of archaeologists from Belgium and northern Germany. Consider the way this panned out in the village of Salone, where Heinrich Himmler, sorry, I'm going to get to this moment in a second. This is still the Russian coverage on the sorry, one second. I will just show. I will come back to the coverage of the. Sorry, so I'll just get to this Third Reich story, and then I'll come back to this. So in particular, this so in this village of Salone, where Heinrich Himmler, as part of the Special Office Rosenberg, oversaw both the rounding up of the Jews and the looting of cultural heritage simultaneously. While the 49 Jews of the village were rounded up and shot in the center of the village, drawing on help from local forced labor, the teams of archaeologists worked carefully on revealing aspects of the Kurgan culture of this area, with a view to establish Germanic presence there. The East was thus going to be both freed from the Jews using Slavic labor and re-Germanized using the scientific and military expertise of a Nordic group of experts and insights from archaeology. Today, all of this has heightened relevance as the Kremlin has mobilized Eurasianism as one of the ideologies which allows presenting Putin's current project as the defense of Russia as a kind of subaltern empire. In this process, Russian state media championed pro-Russian curators from eastern Ukraine, such as Natalia Kapusnikova, who publicly supported the idea of saving Mariupol's surviving collection. Sorry, I'm going to go back to this lady. Natalia Kapusnikova here on the right, who supported the idea of saving Mariupol's surviving collection by incorporating it into the Kremlin-backed so-called Donetsk People's Republic. Figures like Kapusnikova are now being identified on Ukrainian website for collaborators who will have to be tried in the future. The Kurgan culture, meanwhile, is celebrated as part of a new multicultural self-image of Ukraine. But the nomads are also in favor again with Kremlin-critical exiles from Russia, who expose the princes of Muscovy as mere tributaries of the Golden Horde, contrary to their own self-image as protectors of the civilized frontier. Sorry, so I want to show here, this is the way that Ukrainian Art History Channel has shown how you know, the monuments are really part of the kind of the local culture of Izum, and here it's sort of being protected or attempted to be protected. This is the kind of sort of like pseudo revival of Second World War glory, as it were, by in a newspaper that's styled after the Second World War, but produced for Russians occupying forces. So here you can see a Russian soldier celebrating in a kind of pseudo-Soviet revival style, the sort of liberation of these Babas somehow in this occupation regime for our victory. At an intellectual level, I would say that it's interesting to explore in this light to what extent the future may bring a kind of normalization of the narrative concerning the material culture of the Turkic nomads and their cultural presence in the steppes. This could be done not only from a more global perspective, but also in a way which connects the way modern publics imagine nomadic societies in the context of their own diasporic existence, most recently triggered by Russia's war against Ukraine itself, but also by earlier phases of migration. This could draw on the social anthropology and the anthropology of nomadic landscapes in Inner Asia and elsewhere, and be applied to the reuse of nomadic material culture in the Western steppes. The work of Lithuanian archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, which was developed at the height of the Cold War, might be of relevance in this context. Gimbutas, who had lived under the Soviet and the German occupation, had argued in her influential book Bronze Age Cultures of Central and Eastern Europe that the Pontic-Caspian steppe was a kind of Urheimat of the Indo-Germanic culture. While her Kurgan thesis was criticized, particularly its in a sense, pro-German sort of perspective, the gender thesis was never entirely overruled, but her focus on gender as a lens for understanding the material culture of the nomadic peoples links up in interesting ways to current discussions of Gaia and the Anthropocene, which appear to be based largely on Anglophone scholarship from the 70s. In any case, the old binaries of the Golden Horde versus the civilized West, which the current Russian narrative tries to protect once again, to revive once again, clearly is no longer appropriate. But there's a space here for curators and the global public to discuss how the artifacts themselves might lead to kind of new ways, new ways of contextualizing Ukrainian heritage, in line with the way Ukraine itself has reinvented its national heritage through this multicultural lens. There are certainly parallels to be sought here with the incorporation of nomadic identities into other modernizing polities, for example, the Comanche in the Great Plains of America. And the process of the rescue, the defensive kind of rescue of the Babas as kind of one of the civilian defense attempts of heritage points to this kind of new way of thinking about engaged research, engaged science, engaged archaeology. This is a kind of attempt by the kind of exiled, non-ethnic Russian community that has its sort of mirror image with the League of Free Nations, the sort of attempt to reimagine Russia as a sort of more federal polity. And interestingly, the cultures of the Eurasian steppes allow, I think, this community that are trying to develop their own kind of anti-Kremlin narrative to connect to this. So here, the journalist Kamil Galeev is talking about the Kipchak Khanate cultures in a tweet and sort of showing their global connections. And here, just to give you a sort of different perspective of it in the narrative, which tries to picture the kind of the figures of the exiled, I suppose, Moscow kind of liberals that are seeking some kind of connection to global public. There's a video which advertises Kazakh chocolate, where essentially a man on horseback is meeting this sort of Russian hipster that's trying to escape mobilization. showing him a taste of freedom, this well, particular renowned Kazakh chocolate, which shows a kind of strange, well, revival in the sense of the idea of a nomadic culture and its superiority to this sort of well, yeah, the kind of bankruptcy in the sense of the sort of Russian middle class consumer culture that has left, found a kind of dead end in its existence and is going into exile, escaping mobilization, but not bringing down its own sort of regime. So as we're looking at the current map of the areas in which these nomadic cultures exist, yeah, this earlier research on Kurgan culture by Gimbutas and others might come to mind, might connect this to kind of more international public, and perhaps bring in also some well, transnational possibility for connection. I want to leave you with this 12th century Persian, but now kind of nationalized as Azeri poet, Nizami Ganjavi, who left the earliest trace of the literary description of these nomadic heritage idols in his poem, to show that in a sense there's something about these figures that remains sort of mysterious and gives a sort of slightly different perspective on the impact of the Russian war of aggression on not just the material heritage of Ukraine, but also its multi-ethnic composition and the need to kind of reimagine connecting new narratives of the scientific history of these cultures to a kind of more global context, as the Kremlin itself is struggling to establish itself as a sort of global leader of subaltern empires and trying to reclaim ideas of the global South somehow. So hopefully, I'm thinking that the focus on these nomadic cultures might help reconnect to a kind of saner world picture. So I will leave it at that and hope for more discussion later on.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I guess we will have a lot of questions and comments. Cedric and yes, Svetlana, probably I will ask you to moderate discussion on site. So if you have any comments or questions online, you can put your question in the chat, or you can raise the hand, and it's up to you. And yeah, on site, if we have any questions, also you can ask, or but you need to go to the laptop. Our presenters could hear you. So probably to start the discussion, I have a question to Simon, and because I also observing publications, observing papers in the journals on critical heritage studies, I see now really I cannot say like a lot of, but many publications focused on the one hand on discourses, heritage discourses of dealing with lost Ukrainian heritage or Ukrainian heritage in danger on the occupied territories or on the territories in the context of war. And probably I will try from my perspective, but because I'm not working with archeological heritage, but with heritage discourses, but probably to clarify how do you see probably not the conflicts, but the place, the role of UNESCO in this shaping or probably conflicting heritage discourses in the context of Ukrainian heritage now. And the role on the one hand, on the other hand, does somehow, probably I missed it, UNESCO institutions, UNESCO representatives deal with lost heritage, because I'm trying to formulate it shortly, but with Ukrainian heritage in general, but archaeological heritage in particular, is somehow UNESCO participating in observing or like marking this problem from their side?
Thank you, Alexandra, for the question. I must say this is the question that may be the easiest to trigger me into a very emotional talk, because UNESCO doesn't seem to be very efficient as an organization that performs on the front line, and they repeatedly claim they want to stay out of political statements. So, for example, the training procedures that has been recently provided by my colleagues archaeologists in Lviv regarding how to protect Ukrainian heritage on the front line had the training procedures like so. One of the training procedures they had was let's work with the consequences of what happened at Kakhovka. That was a quote. Yeah, what happened at Kakhovka. And maybe compare it to some flood that happened in Africa a few years ago. They had a heavy rain, so the flood happened and some landscape was damaged. And that is a good example of how UNESCO tries to frame their work with cultural heritage in Ukraine, same as they frame their work with cultural heritage in any other place, which is, in my view, a very bad point to start, because that does not involve local context and local emotional context of Ukrainian participants. UNESCO is doing great, but you're doing better in Odessa, because Odessa is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It performs through archaeological museum and art museum, and they do a lot of work into providing resources for maintaining cultural heritage, but that does not go to cultural heritage preservation. I mean, they don't fund projects that support material heritage. They rarely find efficient digitization project. There are examples when UNESCO donates equipment to the museum that museum does not have capacity to use, and the equipment is just standing there. So it's hard to find an international organization that would be less efficient, but I'm sure that we will see more.
Thank you. So
Actually, sorry, can I just say one more thing about UNESCO? I think one of the problems actually with UNESCO is I think it hasn't found a language to connect its identification of heritage as belonging to some kind of empire, and then the question about the current nation state that is supposed to protect it, or whose legacy it is right now as the kind of the legitimate sovereign sort of power in the region. So there's a constant slippage. So I noticed with regard to these Babas actually that it constantly calls them Russian heritage, or it's kind of classified under Russian, because it just sort of is part of the Russian Empire, but it's not then paying attention to the location of the of these monuments in specific states, and there's no particular production of contextual information with respect to Ukraine as a sovereign state, or indeed any other of the sovereign states that are that have those monuments in their remit somehow. So I think it's a clear oversight, and that actually led. I mean, I think in the case of the Odessa campaign. I mean, that's why UNESCO struggled. In the end, it's sort of the recent campaign about the imperial monuments in Odessa and the question whether they're Russian or not Russian. Or I mean, UNESCO really struggled to find kind of an appropriate line to kind of take position there because of this lack of clarity in its own infrastructure, I think, about these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is definitely that I observed from the other side, working with heritage discourses in Russian Likhachov Institute for Cultural Heritage, because after annexation of the Crimea, they started to promote how to say it, not the new system of evaluating cultural heritage. It is based on UNESCO system of evaluation of cultural heritage, and they use definitely the concept, the terminology of UNESCO, but promoting the idea that this is Russian heritage, and so it should be included in Russian programs, and so on and so on. And one of the mainstream programs now in the Likhachov Institute for Cultural Heritage, it is Russian North and the Crimea. So they're using this terminology, the language, the UNESCO language, but to arguing that this is the part of Russian heritage. And as far as I can see, there is nothing said, nothing written from the UNESCO side in this context.
What I see here, if I may add, is that international cultural heritage organizations are really bad with borderlines. And when it goes to some international activities, they really want to avoid front lines and any possible danger. So when I compare it to international archaeological organizations, it's much easier for them because international archaeological organizations, they emerge on these conflict situations. Like European Archaeological Association, they have a clear statement about what's going on the front line and how to support Ukrainian archaeologists. And this is because they emerge from what happened in Czech Republic in 1968. So their political statements are very straightforward. And that's the difference, I guess.
I'm also sorry, I'm just wondering what, because for archaeologists, it must be very clear that in a sense, there's ultimately the layering goes sort of down into, I mean, there's a kind of objective discussion of the historical layers, essentially, that will give you some sort of answer that takes them out of the problem of the horizontal level demarcation, because you can solve the horizontal question with presumably with the
vertical. Well, it all depends on your imagination, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I generally agree with you, but on the other hand, one can, for example, destroy all cities of Golden Horde in Ukraine and pretend they never were there, or narrativize Chersonesos not as a Greek colony, but as a center of Russian Orthodox Christianity. Yeah, and that will be supported by archaeological evidence. By the way, you gave a very good example to that with Kernasovsky idol from Dnipro Museum. That is actually used to be considered as an art, but the stone Baba made by first Indo-Europeans, first people of modern European genomic structure. And the question is whether the origination of this modern European genomic structure comes from territory of modern Russia or territory of modern Ukraine is a very topical archaeological question these days that archaeologists try to solve with ancient DNA, and it contributes massively to both Ukrainian and Russian cultural narratives. So that's a very heated debate there. No borders, but they are there.
On side, if you have any questions.
We have question on site. Okay, but okay. Yeah, please go to the laptop. Otherwise, we cannot hear you.
We've got the question here.
Yeah, because there is an echo in the room and nothing is heard.
I have one question. What is this relativistical political geography? In your presentation, you indicated this new concept. Please detail your presentation.
Yeah, there's an expert.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's an expert from the paper published by Kolosov. I'm not sure about the first name. Russian geographer who's introducing and several ideas of political geography. There is, if I may, there is a QR code to references and sources, and there are 3 texts of Kolosov where he introduces this concept. And I really loved the formulation because it explains a lot about what I was trying to say today in terms of how Russian occupational forces see Ukrainian territories and cultural heritage. I guess I will send the PDF over after that, so the link would be available. Yeah, that sounds reasonable, because I realize they have a lot of sources, and make some claims that need to be backed up with sources. So it's better to do it that way.
I have little questions for Simon. Do you have a lot of object?
Svetlana, sorry, please turn on your own, because we don't hear you. Or turn on microphone on your laptop because yeah. Oh, here.
Yeah,
Still
but we need, you need to unmute this laptop also. Yeah, I cannot do it, unfortunately.
It's okay now? Sorry. I have a little questions for Simon. You say there are a lot of objects that were stolen from a museum in Ukraine. And I'm worried about that. Do you have like the catalog of this object? Do somebody interested in to do it, or it's only in the a local ex-Ukrainian territory where this object are going, or now it's some object to go to the center of Russian Republic, to Moscow or St. Petersburg? Thank you.
Thank you. It depends very much on different objects. We know, for example, that objects from Kam'yana Mohyla were relocated to Crimea, so they are technically in Ukraine. And we have only the catalog of portable rock art objects from there because this is the catalog I made for my PhD, and no one ever cared about things on Kam'yana Mohyla before that. We have catalogs from those museums where directors were passionate enough about making these catalogs and copying them, backuping them in Ukraine before the war started. So that works, for example, for Kherson Museum, for Melitopol Museum. I'm not sure it worked for example, Kamenka-Znamenka Museum because it was very small. I'm not sure how it worked with Mariupol's regional museum. And yeah, that's it. And then different objects are treated differently. We know that objects from Chersonesos were transferred to Novgorod and never went back, actually. We know that objects from Melitopol were transferred to continental Russia based on the claims of the head of Melitopol Museum, Leila Ibrahimova. Yeah. So there are different cases. We also know there's more peculiar cases about, for example, Ivan Ivazovsky a painting that has been put on the auction last year, stolen from Kherson Museum and put on the international auction. So it can be very different.
Because I said, sorry. I think it's the problem now. It's just the dark market for all stolen things, because it's like in Afghanistan, it's absolutely impossible to control anything in this kind of chaos of linking to the war and post-war situation, if you have it.
Yes. Yeah, unfortunately, Ukraine did well with black market or archeological goods before the war. Now we are going to, well, we actually now just signed the law that aligns us closer with Nicosia Convention that should make it heavily illegal and put a stop to the black market scenes, at least in Ukraine, and harden the transfer very much. Russia also ratified Nicosia Convention, but they never aligned the law to put it to shape. Yeah, so actually, I must say that we did not do our homework very well about protecting our cultural heritage from black market. We are now doing that, but the problem will be massive. And this is basically what European Union now aligns to the state terrorism and cultural heritage terrorism. So yeah, that's a very heavy claim.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have more questions? Yes.
So maybe if there is no questions on site, so maybe one more question from our online site. Maybe it's for both presenters. So maybe I've lost it. Or maybe we just need some generalization. So how can we say? How can you say? Sorry. How does digitalization and various new digital, I don't know, tools help or maybe make anything easier in this perspective, or how it could help, or maybe somewhere in the future. Thank you very much once again for two brilliant presentations.
I maybe can start on that if, yeah, is it okay? Well, there are several ways. First, obviously, what is digitized is never lost forever. It is the information preservation, and this is important. We can see cases where something has been digitized and then damaged. I had it in my own projects as well. Then digitization is a recording strategy. So once it's recorded, we know it was there. And then when it's not there anymore, we can track it. Like it happened with these stones on Kamienna Mohyla. I had a digital catalog, at least as photos, and then aligned these photos to basically OSINT stones from Chersonesos. And the other interesting thing is that 3D digitization is even more efficient here. It's hard to use 3D as evidence in court. Courts don't like 3D too much, but it's way easier to OSINT cultural heritage object if you have a 3D than if you have 2D. I use it in my practice few times because we rarely have a proper visual recording from inside Russia, from let's say exhibitions in Crimea. So I want to rotate the object and find a good angle to be able to identify it, and I need 3D for that. So these things, and of course, it's way easier to track damages if you have a proper photogrammetry, aerial photogrammetry of a landscape. So 3D model of a landscape, basically. You can assess the destruction by trenches, by destruction of kurgans, etc., etc. So this is a very important part. In Ukraine, things with digitization go way better now than it was. We actually advanced in 3 years very much. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that most of 3D digitization projects were sponsored by Americans and now they are shut down. My own 3D digitization project has been shut down yesterday with an official letter from Doji, so I can confirm that this is happening. Yeah, but this work is going and we're doing much better than it was before the full-scale animation.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I actually want to just reiterate the importance of this and kind of lobbying for digitization of this looting and basically tracking social media accounts and Telegram and all of that. Because just to use, I mean, I know, it's like, it's not for nothing that Russian law has outlawed, comparisons with the Third Reich that, I mean, shouldn't be used lightly. But when it comes to cultural plunder, it's, I just want to screen share, right? So there's this famous project about reconstructing the Rosenberg cultural plunder in the Third Reich, which led to the production of this map and a lot of very interesting digital restitution efforts for libraries and cultural artifacts and so on that are kind of involve complicated multi-archive research of different people. And I think this is a very good use of all of our time, because eventually it's going to sort of to become relevant, right? The question of restitution. I mean, we might have to wait. I mean, maybe it's another generation, but keeping the data intact and actually collecting the data on where the stuff is going, and also how it's used by people, individuals who are. I mean, we now have all these social media accounts of, individual soldiers, photographing themselves with this stuff, and that will be extremely important for questions of accountability, individual accountability, not just collective. So I think it's absolutely crucial. Yeah.
Sorry, my computer is dead. But I'd like to know, somebody would like to ask any other things, other questions in the Zoom or in the room? I have one question more, if possible. When you show, Simon, this picture about discussion in the Russian academia, the some cultural heritage, we can see it's really old people. In Russian academia, there are the young generation who would like work about Ukrainian heritage or not, or it's really the monsters of Soviet period.
Well, they are not that old. I mean, there is this new general prosecution against the guy who excavated in Crimea quite a lot, Budyagin. He's somewhat 50 years old. This is not too old. But I'm not sure I know any. Well, I never checked it specifically, but I'm not sure I know any archaeologist younger than 30 who is actively involved in excavating or plundering Ukrainian archaeological heritage. The bad news, though, is they are way less visible because they are in the shadow of project leaders who are older. So I'm not, yeah, actually can't answer to this question. I'm sure it's possible to answer it, but I don't know the answer.
Thank you very much. What?
That was brilliant. I have no questions at all.
No, it was really brilliant, and I'm really happy because your two presentations was very not similar, but in the same way. It's the same topic. It's very important to put all things together to understand the situation. And thank you very much for your reflections, for your presentations, and for the brilliant questions too. Thank you.
Thank you.
And after it's another questions, I don't know, it's really up to you. If you want, we can put your presentations online in our site and our YouTube channel. Or if you have some hesitation, you can say no. It's really up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.